and gentlemen, citizens and guests, welcome. Recent polls show that 2 out of 3 Americans think that our government is going in the wrong direction. Many of us feel confused and conflicted, not knowing what or who to believe. Surrounded by a fog of deceit, we long for a beacon of clarity. We feel the storms of war thundering before us, blowing away our rights with the gale winds of fear and burning down the edifice of our morality with the lightning fires of hate. Yet this human tragedy is as old as war itself, but fought now with weapons newly spawned in the laboratories of devastation. America must come to realize that the fog of lies and the storms of war are our own creation, our creation of our own destruction. And they have a history. They have a direction. They have a tragic conclusion. To find the clarity to guide us in a different direction, we recall the past so as not to repeat its deadly conclusion. We evoke the past to foresee the future, ever mindful that it is we who choose the direction and bring it into being and nurture it. Tonight, we evoke 3 leaders who have shaped our history. And now, please welcome Dwight David Eisenhower, the commander of the Allied military forces in World War II, in Europe, and he, the president who stopped the war in Korea. Please welcome the sage of Monticello, Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence. The governor of Virginia, the ambassador to France, the founder of the University of Virginia, and our 3rd president. And now please welcome the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the leader of the Civil Rights Movement and the pioneer of nonviolent resistance. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming in this our time of darkness. America appears to be going in the wrong direction, and so we seek your counsel. We will follow the political debate format tonight. Gentlemen, we call on each of you to tell of the dangers for America that you faced. President Eisenhower, would you begin with the dangers posed by the military-industrial complex?
Thank you, Madam Moderator. My fellow Americans, before World War II, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But now we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security more than the net income of all U.S. corporations. This conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, and every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development. Yet, we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
Thank you, President Eisenhower. It appears that the danger of misplaced power has grown more grave. In our time, the military-industrial complex is in charge, bribing statesmen, financing academic research, and perverting technological innovation by waging more and more wars for higher and higher profits. President Jefferson, as one of the founding fathers, we are interested in your perspective on the dangers that faced America at its beginning.
Thank you all for coming here tonight. Men by constitutions are naturally divided into two parties. Those that fear and distrust the people and wish to draw all powers from them into the hands of the higher classes, namely the aristocrats, and those who identify with the people, cherish them, and consider them to be the most honest and safe, namely the Democrats. What has destroyed liberty and the rights of man in every country that has ever existed under the sun is the generalizing and concentrating of all cares and powers into one body. No matter whether it's the autocrats of Russia or France, or the aristocrats within our own borders, or even the federal government. Never should we see transferred offices all to Washington, where further from the eyes of the people, they may be more secretly bought and sold as at market. I wish to avoid our collapse. In my time, our country was already taking so steady a course as to show by what road it would pass to destruction. Namely, the consolidation of power first, and then corruption, its necessary consequence. To avoid that, I wish to see maintained that wholesome distribution of powers established by the Constitution for the limitation of government, with foreign concerns limited to the federal government and home concerns to the states. Furthermore, I hope we shall crush in its birth the aristocracy of moneyed corporations, which dare already to challenge our government to a trial of strength and bid defiance of the laws of our country.
Thank you, President Jefferson. It appears that the race for the consolidation of power continues to tear apart the restraints of the Constitution. Even business is turned into a battlefield, with powerful corporations devouring their competition. In the same manner, our news has been consolidated to a point where our democratic institutions are in peril.
Newspapers, why, truth itself becomes suspect by being put into that polluted vehicle. I'm afraid that advertisements contain the only truths to be relied on in a newspaper.
Not anymore. Even advertising is a source of mind control. Technology has now grown to a point where we can record and replay events. But even that advancement has failed to protect the truth. Unfortunately, the art of deceit has grown into the science of propaganda. And those who profit from deceit are free to use that dark science. Reverend King, as the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, we are interested in your thoughts about our involvement in so many wars.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I am honored to meet with President Eisenhower and President Jefferson. President Eisenhower, during the 1950s, at the height of the Montgomery bus boycott, other civil rights leaders and I myself sought to meet with you then to get you to come down to the South and see for yourself what we were suffering, but to no avail. Now, I am pleased that on this topic of war, we are able to meet. President Jefferson, whose words have inspired so many, I am pleased to meet you personally, now that on the Mall in Washington, D.C., we gaze at each other across the tidal basin. Pondering a nation where a slave owner and descendant of slaves can be at peace and see each other as equals across time and space. I am honored to be here. I believe that every man lives in two realms, the internal and the external. The internal is that realm of spiritual ends expressed in art, literature, morals, and religion. The external is that complex of devices, techniques, mechanisms, and instrumentalities by means of which we live. Our problem today is that we have allowed the internal to become lost in the external. We have allowed the means by which we live to outdistance the ends for which we live. So much of modern life can be summarized in that arresting dictum of the poet Thoreau: improved means to an unimproved end. This is the serious predicament, the deep and haunting problem confronting modern man. If we are to survive today, our moral and spiritual lag must be eliminated. Enlarged material powers spell enlarged peril if there is not proportionate growth of the soul. When the without of man's nature subjugates the within, dark storm clouds begin to form in the world. To establish that balance within politics, we must look across the world and see the investment in the means of production without reflection on the ends of production. This is not just. We must look at our alliances with the privileged in all the world, while leaving the least of those to side and say, this is not just. The Western arrogance of feeling that it has everything to teach others and nothing to learn from them is not just. A true revolution of values will lay hands on the world order and say of war, this way of settling differences is not just. This business of burning human beings with napalm, of filling our nation's homes with orphans and widows, of injecting poisonous drugs of hate into the veins of peoples normally humane, of sending men home from dark and bloody battlefields, physically handicapped and psychologically deranged, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death.
Thank you, Reverend King. The storm clouds of war darken with the growing collusion between the government and corporations. In the name of security, aggression is called defense, and exploitation is called national interest, while the cries for justice of an impoverished world remain silenced by corporate news. Gentlemen, thank all of you for opening your statements. Please enter now into a conversation with one another.
General Eisenhower, you spoke of the necessity of a vast arms industry conjoined with an immense military establishment. And you hope that statesmen can balance that with democracy and freedom. As I mentioned in my opening statement, that I too feared for our government due to the strength and defiance of corporations. And that was in 1816. I imagine that the arms industry of today would be vastly more dangerous. As for an immense military establishment, why, even a standing army endangers our lives and liberties. You say that we can no longer risk emergency improvisation for national defense. Rather, we require this military-industrial complex. Well, I see that our resources will be exhausted whenever a speck of war appears on the horizon, rather than being reserved for our real needs. Gentlemen, liberty is dangerous. And we must be brave and confident that we can meet our security needs. Dr. Franklin said it well. Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety.
The technological revolution is largely responsible for the military-industrial complex within present world structures. On the other hand, I hate war as only a soldier who has lived it can, only as one who has seen its brutality, its futility, its stupidity. And like President Jefferson, I recognize the waste of war, that every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies in the final sense a theft from those who hunger and are unfed, from those who are cold and not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. This is not a way of life at all, in any true sense. It is under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron.
I felt that connection. A few years ago, there was a shining moment in the struggle against poverty. It seemed as if there was a real promise of hope for the poor, black and white, through the poverty program. Then came the build-up of Vietnam, and I watched the program broken and eviscerated as if it were some idle political plaything of a society gone mad on war. And I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor so long as Vietnam continued to draw men and skills and money like some demonic, destructive subject. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor, to attack it as such.
All men know that war is a losing game for both sides. It is the greatest scourge of mankind. Not only robs the present, but the future generation. If it were incumbent on each generation to pay its debts as it goes, that would eliminate half the wars in the world. I predict future happiness for Americans if we can prevent the government from wasting the labors of the people under the pretense of protecting them.
Gentlemen, we will not build a peaceful world by following a negative path. It is not enough to say we must not wage war. It is necessary to love peace and sacrifice for it. President Eisenhower, what is your peace plan?
I think there are a few clear precepts which should govern the conduct of world affairs. First, no people on earth can be held as a people to be enemy, for all humanity shares a common hunger for peace and fellowship and justice. Second, no nation's security and well-being can be lastingly achieved in isolation, but only in effective cooperation with fellow nations. Third, any nation's right to form a government and an economic system of its own choosing is inalienable. Fourth, any nation's attempt to dictate to other nations their form of government is indefensible. And fifth, a nation's hope of lasting peace cannot be firmly based upon any race armaments, but rather upon just relations and honest understanding with all other nations. I believe that these principles define a way toward true peace.
I shake my head being I agree with your principles, but did your administration live by them? Didn't you treat the communists as enemies? Didn't you try to isolate them? Did you allow Vietnam to choose its government or its economic system? Did you restrict the armaments race?
I believe those principles would have led to true peace, but the Soviet government held a vastly different vision of the future. In the world of its design, security was to be found not in mutual trust and mutual aid, but in force, huge armies, subversion, and rule of neighbor nations. The goal was power superiority at all costs. Security was to be sought by denying it to all others. The result has been tragic for the world and for the Soviet Union, and has also been ironic.
"50 tragic years later, the irony falls on us. For now, our government has taken the place of the Soviets by our security at all costs, with military expenditures almost as large as all other nations combined, by our superiority with over 700 military bases in over 148 countries around the world, by our dominance from economic coercion, and by our subversion with covert mercenaries. President Eisenhower, America has become the new Soviet Union. President Jefferson, America has become the new British Empire.
Gentlemen, we cannot achieve peaceful ends by violent means. We need a new method to resolve our conflicts. Nonviolent resistance is a new political dynamic pioneered by Mohandas Gandhi to attain independence from Great Britain and use the civil rights movement here in America. In a real sense, nonviolence seeks to redeem the spiritual and moral lag that I spoke of earlier as the chief dilemma of modern man. It seeks to secure moral ends through moral means. Nonviolence is a powerful and just weapon. Indeed, it is a weapon unique in its history, which cuts without wounding and ennobles the man who wields it. Nonviolent resistors can summarize their message in the following simple terms. We will take direct action against injustice, despite the failure of governmental and other official agencies to act first. We will not obey unjust laws or submit to unjust practices. We will do this peacefully, openly, cheerfully, because our aim is to persuade. We adopt the means of nonviolence because our end is a community at peace with itself. We will try to persuade with our words, but if our words fail, we will try to persuade with our acts. We will always be willing to talk and seek fair compromise, but we are ready to suffer when necessary and even risk our lives to become witnesses to truth as we see. I believe in this method because I think it is the only way to reestablish a broken community. It is the method which seeks to implement the just law by appealing to the conscience of the great, decent majority who through blindness, fear, pride, and irrationality have allowed their consciences to sleep.
Reverend King, I am shocked. Are you telling me that India broke free from Great Britain without a fight? That the American colonies could have had independence without the Revolutionary War? With due respect, sir, I do not believe it.
President Jefferson, a lot of progress has been made in the 200 years since your presidency. As Reverend King said, nonviolent resistance is a new political dynamic, pioneered by Mohandas Gandhi beginning in South Africa in 1906. He later used it to attain Indian independence from Great Britain. And it was Reverend King who used it in the civil rights movement in America, which led to desegregation in the United States. Although not generally realized, these principles of peace have succeeded in so many contexts as to make war obsolete.
Mahatma Gandhi embodied in his life certain universal principles that are inherent in the moral structure of the universe. And these principles are as inescapable as the law of gravitation.
Reverend King, I have a dream. In my version of the Declaration of Independence, I deplored slavery as a cruel war against human nature itself, violating the most sacred rights of life and liberty. That entire section was stricken from the Declaration. So now, I am overjoyed that we can finally live by that self-evident truth, that all men are created equal. But I am most intrigued by this method of nonviolent resistance, for it points to a way of revolution, as you say, without wounding community, as well as a method to reunite a community broken by injustice. Well, gentlemen, experience hath shown that even under the best forms of government, those entrusted with power will, in time, and by slow operations, pervert it into tyranny. And when the majority, the law of the majority, ceases to be acknowledged, there government ends. And the law of the strongest takes its place, and life and property belong to he who can take it. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government.
President Jefferson, in 1945, the country of Vietnam began their Declaration of Independence by quoting yours. All men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Our country ended up going to war with Vietnam. This shows that our nation is taking the role of those who make peaceful revolution impossible by refusing to give up the privileges and the pleasures that come from the immense profits of overseas investment. I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin to shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, The giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. Our only hope today lies in our ability to recapture the revolutionary spirit and go out into a sometimes hostile world, declaring eternal hostility to poverty, racism, and militarism. With this powerful commitment, we shall boldly challenge the status quo and unjust war.
As for militarism, if men can develop weapons that are so terrifying as to make the thought of global war include almost a sentence for suicide, you would think that man's intelligence and his comprehension would include also his ability to find peaceful solutions. The hunger for peace is too great, the hour of history too late, for any government to mock men's hopes with mere words and promises and gestures. I like to believe that people, in the long run, are going to do more to promote peace than our governments. Indeed, I think that people want peace so much that one of these days, governments had better get out of their way and let them have it.
Gentlemen, thank you all for your deep insights. It's now time that each of you give a closing statement. First, President Jefferson, then Reverend King, and then ending with President Eisenhower.
Reverend King points to a life where moral and spiritual ends